The Institute is a bridge between the university and the community. It's also at the core of the mission of NYU Abu Dhabi. So we started building bridges with the community because the lectures we put on were essentially for the community. Our aim was, of course, it always has been to reach out to Emiratis in the public and private sectors, to make Emiratis part of the conversation we were establishing.
We invite up to 800 people, 800 international scholars every single year to gather in up to 30 conferences and workshops. So one can say that part of our mission, and this relates directly to the mission of the university, is to bring international scholarship, international culture to the region. And the UAE is a great country in facilitating us to do that.
We stress is the fact that this is a research-based institution, so that the people we invite to speak are scholars, researchers, experts in their field. They're people who are pushing the envelope in their field. So whatever they speak about, they're providing insights to people, advanced level research, made accessible to the public.
So the Institute has several goals. An important one is outreach to a general public, which is generally addressed by this fantastic evening program that we run. Lectures about an hour, and then you have a Q&A, and people get very involved in what we as a community have to offer in terms of scholarship that is of interest to a wider public.
I'm confident that the Institute will continue to put on events on a par with the events we've put on in the past. The quality of the events will sustain that. And why am I confident? Because this is the whole, this region, this place in particular, Abu Dhabi, is growing, developing. There's so much more for us to draw on. More students, more faculty, a growing community, and obviously issues that won't go away, that touch us all. These things don't go away, so there's more and more for us to talk about. We really can promise, a growing phase in the next 10 years.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today on a panel discussion titled The Map of Cities, the Making of Building Sharjah. I would foremost like to thank NYU Abu Dhabi for arranging this panel discussion, and of course our panelists and the audience for making the time to attend this session. My name is Shatha Mulla, the Director of Art at the Ministry of Culture and Youth. It is my utmost pleasure to moderate this session with such an amazing panelist, and would like to take the opportunity to firstly introduce each one of them. Briefly, Sultan Sooud Qassemi is the Fall 2021 Kuwait Foundation Visiting Scholar at Harvard Kennedy School and the co-editor of Building Sharjah. Todd Reisz is an architect and a writer. His work examines the global practice of architecture, specifically how the architect circulates technologies and cultural narratives. His book, Showpiece, City, How Architecture Made Dubai, explores architecture's packaging to sell Dubai on a global stage. He is also the co-editor of Building Sharjah. Reem Khorshid is an architect and a researcher who examines architecture and urbanism. She is currently pursuing her master's degree in architecture from Yale University. Reem's work has been exhibited at Jameel Art Center and the Spatial Sound Institute. Her writings has appeared in Platform, Mada Masr, and the Daily News Egypt. Farah Fayyad is a graphic designer and a printmaker from Beirut, a highly print-oriented designer. Most of Farah's work has focused on a lot of experimentation and played with the Arabic script and Arabic typography and bilingual publications and exhibition design. Between 2012 and 16, she was part of Studio Safar, one of Beirut's leading design studios, developing projects primarily for the creative cultural field. In July 2018, she co-founded Nice Nice Prints, a screen printing studio, shop, and workshop space in Beirut. She's also the art director for Dar al Nasser for Arts and Culture in Beirut. Farah is currently based in Amsterdam and is pursuing her master's degree at the Design Department and the Stanford Institute. Welcome you all to an exciting hour and a half of the behind the scenes of Building Sharjah. Firstly, I would like to give the opportunity to Sultan in specific to give us a glimpse on the book, its structure and its content, and what really motivated every one of you in terms of driving intentions and motivations with working on this book in specific.
Thank you so much, Shatha, for giving us this opportunity. I think I'd like to start with the motivation rather than the content of the book. Maybe Todd can jump in when we speak about the content. But with regards to the motivation, I think maybe unlike some of my other colleagues in this project, my motivation of coming into this book is highly personal. Sharjah is a city I was born in, and it's a city I grew up in, spent my formative years here. It's a city where my parents are from. It's a city where I made most of my friends. And so I come to it from a personal lens, maybe rather than a professional lens, although I needed the professional lens and all the skills that Todd, Reem, Farah, and our other colleagues brought together. Basically, growing up in Sharjah in the 80s and 90s, I was accustomed to seeing a lot of the modern architecture that sprang in the 1960s and 70s. I would go to school and see landmarks. I would, go to see friends and pass by the clock tower monument or by certain buildings that I got accustomed to. But then slowly around the turn of the century, this last millennium, I noticed that these buildings were disappearing one by one. And I felt as though I was losing familiar individuals. I wouldn't say friends, but I felt like as though, like a classmate or somebody that I was familiar with was disappearing. And I think one of the buildings that really affected me was the disappearance of this building that we refer to as the Mother Cat building in Sharjah, because we used to go to Dubai all the time, and this building was always on the way to Dubai, back and forth. I see it, and I remember it because it has this giant black cat on its side. So this was the motivational, one of the motivations. And the other one was the building that you have now on the screen, which is the building that was constructed in the late 1970s when I was born. And this building was a building I spent 20 years in, working professionally on the third floor, the balcony there on the right. But I had no idea about it. I had no idea who designed it. I had no idea who built it. I had no idea when it was built. And that was, I think, a curiosity. How can I not know, the history of this building in which I had spent so much time? And it took a while. It took us maybe longer than any other building to find information about this specific project. But I hand over to Todd perhaps here. Todd, you're on mute.
Sultan, when he reached out to me, I'd known him for several years already, but when he reached out to me right at about the time I was on a deadline to finish the final manuscript of Showpiece City, and he asked, hey, how about a book on Sharjah? And I thought, well, I've been doing this book on Dubai for so long, it's not going to be that difficult to work on. And, working with Sultan will be a pleasure. And of course, he will be the one who, will make sure that we can get doors open in Sharjah to get the information we need. All of that ended up being completely inaccurate. Sharjah was a completely different city, responding to all sorts of new and updated kind of global scenarios and its kind of accelerated moments of development. And of course, Sultan had to show that it wasn't his ability to know Sharjah, it was actually his talent at convincing people to work with us. That actually was what made working with Sultan that much more delightful.
Thank you so much, Todd. Farah, Reem, if you have any inputs, your inspiration, your driving motivation behind working on a book that really took a lot of your time, your nights for the last 5 years working on this. So what was your driving force behind this book?
I can start. Farah, feel free to jump in anytime. But I think it was really interesting for me because before I was approached to start working on that book, I didn't have any kind of prior experience with in Sharjah whatsoever. Or even in the UAE, I was still based in Cairo. I was an undergraduate studying architecture and engineering, and I would say that what was really interesting was the timing that Sultan approached me to start working on that book. It was a time when there was a lot of conversations going on about heritage, modern architecture, and preservation, especially in Cairo. And at that time, I think the architectural community, or like people in the architectural community were starting to understand more that buildings do not really convey just architectural and technological like aesthetic, but also they say a lot about the political, cultural, and economic setting at that time that they were built. And I think this is where I saw the importance, or like the significance in being part of this project, knowing how underdocumented and undervalued modern Arab cities are.
Yeah, and for me, it was such a great opportunity to learn about a history I really knew nothing about. And throughout the process, I got access to really incredible archival material. So I felt extremely privileged to have access to this material and to be able to put it together into one object. And also the team was so accommodating and trusting. It was by far like one of the best experiences I've had working on a project.
Such an amazing insight. Thank you so much. I think a lot of the audiences may not hear this again, with insights on how you guys really started working on the book and thinking about working, and what really drove you through this book, through the 5 years that you guys have invested in this book. I think maybe personally, on a personal level, I was really interested in this book for many reasons. And I think on a personal level, reading through the book and being from Sharjah, I would say the book really adds a lot to it's too dear to my own heart, I would say, for multiple reasons. One would be that my family, for the first time, did contribute to a book, and the images in front of you are part of what we actually handed over to Sultan to select from, which is a building very dear to our family that my grandfather built, which was Cinema Sharjah, the Sharjah Cinema. It was the first roofed cinema, I would say, in the city of Sharjah. It was built in 1972, and it had an amazing Chinese restaurant still existing in the UAE, in Sharjah, called the Peking Restaurant. So, of course, the project in itself was very dear to me. And when I read through the book, I was really emotionally connected, I would say, for one. But I think the other thing that I really was happy to know that my family in itself, they were very excited to, contribute to the book. They were willing to even open up their doors to, look at the collection and the archive material, which is usually on the first floor on my grandmother's house that no one has access to. So it was for us a chance to actually get into those rooms to, explore the content. And specifically, I got this image on the screen because I think it really resonates with the idea when we were young. We used to go to Cinema Sharjah. We used to have like free popcorn and Pepsis, and we used to have like the Chinese food. And the image on the left, which really is one of the opening images of, one of the images that withholds the story of the opening of Sharjah Cinema, which was eventually held at the Peking Restaurant. And if you notice, the plates, the bowls, the cutlery basically was from China in specific, and we still hold the collection in our own family. I remember when we were young, my mother, would give us, we would have these parties and get people to our house, and whenever we have Chinese food, we would use the dishes that you see. So we still hold that collection in our family, and I think it's so much that we connect to the collection of the book and the archive and the history behind it. Maybe on the other side, on the other slide, which is very interesting as well, is that I have been documenting a little bit parts of the history of Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah in specific, and I use my drones to photograph some of the abandoned buildings and the expected to be demolished buildings. For me, the book somehow gave me a list of buildings that I wanted to explore that I never knew about, and I think one of the examples that is mentioned in the book is the kindergartens that were designed by Ja'far Tuqan, and I remember passing by this building and looking at the building, and of course taking photographs. And for me, I think documenting is a part of the narrative of the building. I think we usually always look at the original design of the building and want to really protect that, but I think the building really goes through layers of history and changes and modification, and I think that is much as to be celebrated as the original design and the intention behind it. So there are a lot of buildings that I've covered. I think one of the other buildings that was also mentioned in the book is the trade school in Sharjah. Of course, it was mentioned very briefly, but for me, it was again a a way to move forward to explore some of the buildings that are very different from the other government schools that you see in Sharjah. Of course, when I read the book, I really understood why this specific building, for example, as a school, looks so different from the other government school, specifically because this was driven by the British in terms of establishing it. And you can see other examples in Ras Al Khaimah and others of similar designs, as opposed to the government schools that were funded by the Kuwaitis. So I think the book really connected the dots for me in that sense, and I think it's something that really added to my own knowledge of the history of Sharjah and the different layers. Maybe other stuff that I really think was interesting in the book itself, of course this is my own personal view, is how the book really, and I think this starts with your article, Sultan, is how you really look at your mother and her journey and her role in society. And really for me that article sets the tone for the book, because I knew the book won't be about architecture or urban design or urban planning. It is about people's story. It's about their voices, individual voices in certain instances, in certain articles in your book. So for me, that was really one of the things that really drove me to the book. But at the same time, I remember having a discussion with my brother, who was the key contributor to this book, and he's more into politics and economics, and it was interesting for him as well. So for me, the way I look at the book, it is not a book for architects, just for urban planners. I really see this book for a lot of people who are interested in politics, economics, history, and so on and so forth. So I would recommend this book to a friend that is not an architect, for example. So I think these are my own remarks, my own personal reflections on the book, and I think it has been amazing, to be honest, to read through the book and engage with the content that has been produced. So thank you all for working on the book. I think one of the questions that I really want to ask, did you want to say anything, Sultan?
Oh, no.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So one of the things that I really also wanted to expand on, and maybe we can start with you, Reem, is that when we look at the resources that you guys have tapped into, other than, of course, looking at typical resources like maps and aerial photographs and magazines, you guys have extended, the boundaries of what resource one could use to, get research material and that. And you guys have looked at film clippings, for example, that were, filmed in the UAE. So that was very interesting for me to look at the film and the backdrop of that, those shots where it basically somehow documents Sharjah. So Reem, if you could just let us know your experience while researching and of course collecting the data, but also how it really helped us shape the narrative of the book.
Thank you, Shatha. Very interesting to know how you were feeling reading this book that we spent so much time working on, and to get to answer your question, I think I would have to talk about the main or the general challenge that I believe could possibly fuel the urge or the need to make such publications, or about documenting modern heritage or architectural heritage in general, and that is the absence or the unavailability of archives, or the inaccessibility to them, even if they exist in the Arab world. And I would say that this is an issue that cannot be separated or detached from the socio-political landscape of the context. But I guess this was the driving force for us to look for information beyond the archive, or more like to build our own archive, to be able to create this book. And I would say that there were times when we relied on oral histories, conducting interviews, getting to a story that have been passed on, and then to us. And then we would face another issue or another challenge of verifying these stories and narrative to resolve the issue of authorship, or conflicting information and who actually designed this project. Sometimes it would have two conflicting names or attribution to one building, but you're not really sure who the actual architect of that project. And the reason we have to do this verification is it's somehow we get to tell a story or shape it, and it's such a responsibility to decide to choose which story to tell and how to say it. Right? It's you get so many stories from different sources, and then somehow as researchers we need to be subjective and on what we have to say. And I would say that also the research process definitely wasn't linear. It was branch-out and filled with unexpected findings in the most unusual places, or unusual documents. For example, Delhi High Court, where we found information about one of the firms because we found a case file that the wife of one of the founders of the office had filed against the two other founders that has to do with the practice. And also on the screen you have like you have letters, you have a telephone directory that tell you about the offices that were operating at that time. It's not just about architectural document that we find where we find information, but sometimes you can find stuff in magazines, you can find stuff in letters and books and interviews, like brochures, that or even like documents about conferences where like Australian architects or construction companies were coming to the UAE. And such type of unusual findings did not only help document what we knew has once existed or still like exists but being threatened to be demolished, but I think it helped us identify buildings that we didn't know existed because they have been long demolished before we started doing this research. And you know, the absence of information about them, like especially the buildings from the 1960s that were built before the thorough municipal documentation started taking place. And I think there was also a process where we relied on like the UAE community in general to help us identify those buildings that we have found in photographs. I think Farah can get to the next slide. Like some of those buildings, we had no idea. Maybe you could tell from the street that they were located on Al-Aruba Street, but we have very little information about those structures or who built them or who designed them. And that when you know someone who would tell you about the owner, and then from the owner you get to the contractor, and then from the contractor you would get to the architect, and etc. And then you start to formulate like the whole picture about such project, or like specific building and so on. And I believe that without information about these projects, we can just feature like pictures of buildings or like cityscapes without proper information. Otherwise, they become some kind of like, how do I know, speculation in a way. And I think the last thing I would like to say, that working on this book made me realize how abstract of an idea an archive is. Like what is really an archive? Like what are the documents? You would think, okay, I will get to this archival like institution with an archive and find document there and that's it. But I realized that the idea of an archive could be really an abstract concept, because whatever researchers find or whatever the story and whatever we find, the story or the narrative will always be somehow incomplete.
Thank you so much, Reem. I think the point that you mentioned about validation of content, I think it's so much important. Can you maybe elaborate more on that, of how content was really validated? As you said, like a lot of what you found is not the full story. So what was the process indeed used to validate information that was eventually presented in the book?
I think the first level of validating the information was to find the names on a signed document that was submitted to the municipality, where you have like an actual written proof that this person or this office has worked in that project. But also oftentimes you would approach this office or like try to find that person, and then you realize that, oh, we weren't actually the designer, we were just the architect of record. And we realized that this is a situation, like a case that happened a lot in the UAE, maybe in the Arab region at that time, where you have an architect who actually designed the project, and then you have an architect who submitted the project to the municipality. And this has to do with getting a license to establish an office. Like another scenario, you have Mahmoud Riyad architects who used to design some of the projects in Cairo and then send them to Sharjah to another office who would submit the drawings under their name. So I think to do the second level of verification after having the documents, we try to find the architects, or like to approach the office or the families. And if we can find the architect, we go to the contractor who would have worked with the architect as well, and try to verify the information from them, like which architect did you work with, what was the name of the person who like signs, and on those construction documents that sometimes you find at Sharjah municipality, you have the name of an office and then you have a name of an architect or a person or a draftsman who signed the document. So we try in social media and find those people or like their families or their kids and try to interview them personally. And through them as well, we would get more information, more than that we just have. Because if you have a drawing, it doesn't tell you the full story. It doesn't tell you the anecdotes that happened around construction, especially that some of the projects end up being built in a very different, there are some cases that you have a lot of changes that happen to the construction drawing when you actually try to construct the building. So there would be some differences between the drawing and building that you're looking at.
Great, thank you so much, Reem. Maybe just extending the question to Sultan, maybe just also thinking about your own personal family collection. How accessible were they and how beneficial were they to the book?
I think I would like to add on what Reem was saying is you have to expand the idea what an archive is, because an archive isn't only a collection of documents and an institute. I think what I found was meeting with many individuals in Sharjah led us to a lot of information. And unfortunately, what you don't find in archives is more often than not the case than what you do find in archives. I can tell you a story of this building on the screen now, which is one of my favorite buildings in Sharjah, absolute gem of a modern structure. And unfortunately, little was known about it. We know that it was owned by a Sharjah businessman, a Sharjah-based businessman. It was constructed by a company owned by a former Lebanese prime minister. It was designed by these two Lebanese architects that Reem flew to Beirut to meet a few years ago. But we couldn't include it, even though we had the drawings, because we didn't have any archival images. So I really feel like this is one of the images that we couldn't have, that buildings that we really couldn't include because we had taken a decision to only use archival images. But maybe if we go to the next slide, I can show you another project that we couldn't have included also, which is a Greek architect, Shatha, that came to the UAE. Again, this is to build on your question, my own family connections, reaching out to a former friend of my dad's, finding his grandson, who I knew through common friends, and asking them about this project, which was designed by an associate of Doxiadis, Tombazis, who's still alive, I believe, in his 90s in Greece, stunning building in Sharjah. We couldn't include it because of the lack of archival images as well. But can we just go to the next slide as well, Farah? So finally here, I think the idea of expanding the archive really allowed me to go and meet individuals. In this slide, you see the construction worker, the construction company owner, Ismail al-Zar'ouni, who has been active since the 1960s. You see on the top right, an image of the old people cafe, we say in Arabic, Qahwat al-Shawab, who are there every day. And I went and I met them several times, and they gave me a lot of information. Some of the names that weren't so clear, but they did say this was a foreigner or this was an Arab contractor. So that helped us to sort of limit the search. Met with the Sultan, the gentleman in the top middle photo, passed away in January this year. He came to the UAE in the 50s from Gaza, and he gave us a huge selection of photographs, many of which made it to the book. The bottom right image here, you see Mr. Al-Fardan, who clarified for us the idea that Reem just mentioned about how Mahmoud Riyad's architects were designing in Cairo, and how there were architects of record in Sharjah and the Gulf. And so he says that, yes, this is the person that submitted to us the design, but we knew that it came from Cairo. And that was the firm that actually designed the office. So you need to go and meet these individuals, many of whom are quite advanced in age. For example, also the stories of how some buildings came about. The building on the gentleman here on the left side of the screen, Mr. Dimas, meeting him allowed us to know the origin of the ruler's palace, the story that it was inspired by a movie that they had, that the ruler had watched, and he said, well, design something for me or build something for me that emulates this building. And so again, it's not only the story of who designed the building, but it's also the inspiration that we try to capture in many of the stories in this book.
Thank you so much, Sultan. This is really inspiring. Todd, would you like to add? You're on mute, I think.
Yeah, what I'd like to add to that is maybe to start where Sultan ended there. Both Reem and Sultan mentioned the notion of the archive is a kind of it sits on shaky ground, kind of what is one and when can you call one. I think research is also a similar term that we started to question as well. I mean, research sounds like, we can romanticize that documents will be found in a basement or, never been seen documents. But there's a kind of obsession with these inanimate evidence. But I think the slide that we just showed where Sultan is meeting with people, and maybe not these people in particular, but there were a lot of sit downs and hours and days spent sitting with people and gaining trust with people, and also other kinds of people that we needed, to work on a book like this, a book that we already had, narrowed in scope in a particular way. We also realized that we didn't have all the expertise that we needed to write the parts of the book that we really wanted, and so we needed contributors who also bring their expertise and also their experience and years of research as well. And I just wanted to give a rather quick introduction to each of the people that we approached, both some people who helped us with long form articles and also other ones who contributed short entries for some of the particular buildings. For example, there's Suhaila Takish, who is a curator here in the UAE, and she's written a really wonderful account of contemporary artists in the 1980s. Encountering the blue souk, and also just the engineered landscape of Sharjah in general, and how they would respond to it, and perhaps in some ways of resisting it. We also were very fortunate to come in contact with historian Talal al-Rashid from Kuwait, who really gave us an article that we so badly wanted to have, which started to explain the role that the Kuwaiti government actually played in Sharjah's urban development, and also throughout the crucial states, in fact. So he actually has given us something that is not only looking at how Kuwait worked in building schools, but also building curricula. Abdullah Saad has given us a really touching personal memoir of his family as a Palestinian family living and growing up in Al-Fayha, in a neighborhood of Sharjah. Ammar Al-Attar, who was our photo editor of the project, has sat down with a studio photographer who normally took pictures of weddings and corporate events, but also went out and took pictures of the city. And he's given us an interview, so looking at the city through actually another photographer's lens. We're also very happy to have Deepak Unikrishnan, a writer based in Abu Dhabi currently, who's written a short story called When Men Glow in Sharjah. And it's ongoing proof that literary fiction is also the most, maybe the easiest way to tell truths actually about life in cities. Hind Mizena, an artist and curator, we saw her work at Sharjah Art Foundation on hotels in Sharjah. And so we asked her to use her work to bring us inside a lot of these hotels that we actually only knew from the outside as kind of urban strategies, but she could show us how they were places where different demographics of Sharjah socialized. Finally, the other article written outside this group here is Ali Al-Asabi's article, maybe in a similar way to Suhaila's article, looking at how journalists were responding to this changing and engineered landscape, and also how they were looking to find the voices of people living in the city and how they were experiencing the changing landscape of Sharjah. We then also reached out to some experts who helped us informed some of the particular stories about particular buildings. Michael Kubo, an architectural historian, gave us a really lovely insight into his work, into the Architects Collaborative, who were the architects for the famous Radisson Blu or Intercontinental Hotel in Sharjah. Also, architecture theorist, historian Lukasz Stanek took us to Horfakan with a project that we would never have found without Lukasz. Roberta Fabri, also a professor of architecture here in the UAE, who's done a lot of bit of work on Kuwait, also showed us how Kuwaiti entrepreneurialism, but also experience of architecture made its way through one particular project for a Volvo Caterpillar complex here. Hamid Nasser, a curator, does a really beautiful job of placing the Sharjah Cricket Stadium into a cultural context of the development of a love for cricket here in the city. And then Mohammed Shahid, with his expertise on Cairo, brought a lot better perspective for us on the role that Moment Architects, which was a firm based in Cairo, and how they had such an influential role on shaping Sharjah's landscape. KV Shamsuddin really helped us out in terms of, there was this project called 1000 Villas, which sounded so fascinating to all of us. And he lived there. He was one of the first residents in this development inside Sharjah. And he gives us a truly personal account of living there. And finally, I wanted to mention Mona Al-Musfi, an architect here based in the UAE, who has actually done some of the serious renovation design work here in Sharjah. And she shows us just how deep her renovation kind of imagination is, really, by showing us how much of the history that she's collected on both the Flying Saucer and the Qassemi School. So I just wanted to give a kind of an idea of just how vast the book goes in terms of reaching out to other people, so that we get a very much a multi-layered view of what a map of Sharjah might look like.
Thank you so much, Todd. I think the diverse voices that we read through the book is amazing and fascinating. And I think maybe I would like to jump at one of the questions that we see in the Q&A from Priya, who says, I'm curious to know how, if the migrant workers, especially from South Asia, that are key contributors to building Sharjah, gets represented in your book. If yes, could you discuss the methodology you employed in documenting their stories?
Was it for Shatha?
From Priya.
Who would you like to answer?
Sorry?
Would you like me to answer?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So I'll try to answer this question. We tried. I mean, of course, I definitely acknowledge the enormous role that the laborers, workers, blue-collar workers have played in the construction of the cities and the towns of the Gulf states. Without whose presence these cities wouldn't exist. Again, the big challenge here is trying to track them down, trying to find them, to acknowledge them. In many cases, we found so many images of the construction workers who we tried to present. We really did try to track down individuals. I even had an idea once to interview one of these construction workers who was present in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. But it was, again, these companies that recruited them didn't really keep an archive on how to contact many of them. But we try to present them, we try to acknowledge their presence throughout the book. And I think that it's something where we definitely fall short. I think there's so much more acknowledgement that needs to be done, the role of the construction workers. And what they went through, what they saw, these cities. You can just imagine them coming from towns around the subcontinent and even around parts of the Middle East, where they would come and they would build these giant structures sometimes and leave after a few years, and you really they don't get paid really the amounts of money that you imagine they deserve. And so this was definitely a challenge. And this is something I would like to acknowledge, again, as a co-editor, is one of the places where we fall short is trying to maybe reflect the opinion and the point of view of a construction worker or a laborer which is, I hope, something that can be built upon in the future. If you look at the first image, or one of the first spreads in the book, we have an image of sort of Western businessman and someone who looks like he's from the Gulf on the left side, and on the right side we have this gorgeous photograph of this 4 or 5 men standing together, and we try to present them and highlight them in a way that acknowledges their important and vast contribution.
Thank you so much, Sultan. Maybe jumping on another research-related question, Bhumika says, you rightfully mentioned the subjective nature of choosing which story to tell as part of your research process. Can you speak to the thought process for which buildings, sources, and stories you ended up selecting?
Todd,
yeah, I guess that's getting closer to actually attached to the research. So, well, I mean, not as if research ever ends, but yeah, I mean, so what happens is you start to put together what you have for each building or each topic, and you start to see, you know, I mean, you're making choices, and that's part of the editing process as well. You know, how you want to present a building. I mean, you can present one particular building in so many different kinds of ways, and so we make decisions based upon what we have and what we don't have, and what are some of the larger stories of Sharjah that we wanted to tell. And so, but also the really kind of wonderful kind of coincidences that come up, or the kind of maybe, yeah, I guess coincidence is the best general term for the things that just came up that, you know, connect to another building or something else that's been in the news recently that we wanted to show.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Todd. Maybe moving on to more on the creative and design approach of the book. I remember me and Sultan, we were in one of the meetings and he gave us basically a glimpse of the book. And I remember thinking, this is unusual. Like generally you would have an architectural book with a full bleed image on the cover, and a lot of publishers would say it would make the best sales of the book. And I remember when I got the physical copy of the book, it almost felt like the image on the cover in specific is a window of a building, and a window that gives you enough to be intrigued to look into the building, in our case, the book. So I think, Farah, this is a question especially to you. Please tell us a little bit more about the creative and design approach of the book, and particularly the story behind the cover of the book in specific.
Definitely. So generally speaking, like everyone else is saying, this book is about architecture, but it's also so much about the stories. So for me, it was a very important thing is to move away from what you would typically expect from a very polished book about architecture. And that's why like the choice of material was super important, and especially for the cover. So we went for a fabric cover, which has this like small image. It kind of feels like an old family album. And this was really like very intentional because the book is so personal. And I think a big part of this stems from how much Sultan like absolutely loves this city. And I think it comes across really well. And especially now that it's been published, it's really nice. He's been publishing a lot of, like on Instagram, a lot of people's reactions to the book. And it's really been so moving because I really think it kind of did what we all wanted it to do. From a design perspective, yeah, I kind of went for like a modernist approach. So we have like a strict grid, a lot of emphasis on negative space. We're using one typeface throughout the entire book. So it's kind of about the balance between something that's rigid and strict, like the typography and a grid system, but then that also has a lot of human elements, a lot of warmth. And for me, what was super interesting was the fact that we have photos like this. So here it's a photo of a little girl, and the buildings that we're talking about are just in the background. So to be able to work on something like this was really extremely special. Another important thing was to kind of try to highlight the very different voices within the book, but still stay within a kind of like unified visual language. So articles are treated very differently. For example, the one on the left is this like kind of sci-fi fictional story. So we're using a lot like a strong background color. There's a bit more like experimentation in laying out the article versus Todd's article on the right, for example, which is a bit more academic. So there was a lot of play yeah, and trying to have a rhythm throughout the book, trying to make sure like it's not monotonous in any way. And then with the images themselves, like the one you see here on the left, so we still see the actual like traces of the photograph itself. So we really made sure not to Photoshop things too much, really keep them like as unpretentious and as, you know, raw as they are. And this, I guess, is really like the guiding principle behind the book. And we had like an insane amount of content. So what we ended up with the book was like 570 images, but the amount of photos I was sent is like thousands. And I think actually this also I'm very grateful for, because it was really like choosing the images was very collaborative, which is also really nice. So as a designer, I wasn't just like handed over the content, you know, I was really part of like actually deciding on what gets printed in the end. So yeah, I can just show you a couple of slides. We were very playful with the background colors, with the images, and the colors always came from the images themselves, which was super interesting. This, for example, is a photo just like aesthetically. I mean, for me, it was like, this needs to be in the book. It's just so unusual, you know? So yeah, it was just like such a privilege to be able to go through these images and talk about them and spend time with them. And yeah, these are just a couple of more spreads. This is, yeah, by the way, I didn't do this, the fact that this is your family's building, crazy. This is one of my favorite images inside the whole book. And yeah, for me, I was always also like kind of gravitate towards images that have human elements. It tells you a bit like about the scale, about how people dress. And again, it's this like kind of like socioeconomic layer that you don't really always find in architecture books. And yeah, I also visited Sharjah for the first time during the making of this book, which was super special, because then also like I wasn't just seeing these images as content. And me and Todd had some like super funny experiences walking around. I got my ring randomly polished at this shop, and we snuck into a fire escape of one of the buildings, and we hung out there for a while. Like, so to be able to actually, you know, be in the city for a while, I think also made a huge difference in the process.
I think Sultan and the team, I think you guys need to promise me that I need to see those unshown pictures that you've not Farah included in the book eventually. I think we need to have another session just on those images. Just jumping on another question, I think it's very relevant to, again, the overall creative and design approach from Dia, if I'm mentioning her name correctly. The book has beautiful photos, and it's evident that the team was highly selective about picking the best photos. What was the criteria for choosing the photos?
Can I start with this, even though this is not the question for me, but I just want to say that when we did start, there was nothing to select from. So this idea that we had this huge, vast resource, the beginning we had nothing. There was absolutely zero images that we had access to. So we had to first build up the selection, the images that Farah says that we uploaded onto her. It took a couple of years, maybe 3 years, to find these images. And then we decided, all of us, I think, that we want to look at this book. We want to make it a book that was rooted in a moment in history. So we decided to focus on archival images. So we had this double challenge of there's nothing available, even the existing structures. You know, we don't want to photograph them because it takes away. They've been modified, they've been painted, there's air conditioning units attached to it. It doesn't really reflect what the building looked like. So this was a huge challenge. I think I also want to give a shout out here to Ammar Al-Attar, whose archive was absolutely essential in creating and finding some images that I think nobody else would have had access to. And all the other collaborators, really, Shada, it's impossible to mention. People from Peter Jackson to Mahmoud Al-Sawan, to Dr. Na'man Al-Jalili, and so many others, and even residences in some buildings and some archives. I think I want someone else to answer this question, but I just wanted to give the context of, just to mention that we really didn't have much, and then we were blessed with so many good people who helped us out along the way.
Yeah, I quite panicked. When we decided to start working, I we agreed that I'd come to Sharjah and we, start looking, because I'd seen things on Sultan's, social media. And I got there and we started, actually, we don't really have anything. And so we thought about, okay, what to do. One thing would have been to take contemporary photographs. And that was kind of tricky. And I think it would have been, if we did contemporary photographs, we would probably have only done that. And then right about the time we started getting actually the image that Farah showed of the girl on the rooftop was one of the very first ones we got. And we thought, okay, if we can get, just a few dozen more like this, we can make a book of them. And I think, relying on archival photography, at least for me, allowed us to kind of let go of a contemporary Sharjah and let it be a Sharjah, not only of the past, but also a Sharjah of possibilities, of looking at, wondering at the people who are captured in the photographs, how they were not only seeing the city, but how they were seeing the future of that city, which, was probably very different than the city that we know today.
Shatha, I would just like to add something about this photograph that we have on the screen, that it is so funny because when we used to approach residents for like their personal archives, it wasn't to show that the building, to get images of the building they're occupying, but for the neighboring building. Because normally a resident of a building would take a picture in a balcony or on the roof, but it shows, for example, this image is taken from the building Sultan showed in the very beginning, your family building Sultan, but it's showing Bank Street in the back. So to find a photo of a building somewhere, you have to think where the residents of the surrounding buildings in the neighborhood would have taken photo of that building, and then you approach them. Do you have a picture of the building next to you or the building in front of you that you might have taken of your kids, like at birthday parties and stuff like that, when families are like taking photos or like capturing certain moments?
Reem, you just reminded me of one of the things my mother, I remember, would always do, is like she would have this camera with her, and she would always want to, of course, after a major party or a get together, she would always want to, go and go to the film studio to get the film. I don't know the technical word, but to get the photos out. And I remember when she would go there, she would have like 1 or 2 photos that she could take, and she would always take me with her, and eventually that photo would be of me standing at the studio, and literally that happened at every reel. So like you can see me growing in that images. I was literally telling this story to Todd and Ammar yesterday. So I think it's interesting the reasons behind these images and how they've been taken and how they can really enlighten us with other information that could really help us narrate the story better of Sharjah, I would say.
I thought too, it would be, Shatha, I'd be curious to hear Farah's kind of, from Farah about, her kind of first response to seeing these images, in terms of the quality of them and the low resolution and kind of, we had an amazing designer who was very patient with us. So I'd be curious to hear from her how she recalls looking at these at the first time.
I also had some panic, of course, because some of them are like 7 pixels in total, and I was like, there's no way, this cannot be printed. It was just a matter of like finding images like this, for example. Really, I think this one in specific I just like remembered and never forgot. It's so well composed, it's like this rule of thirds is there. And that's what's really nice about going through these things, is that when someone isn't intentionally trying to create a beautiful image, something else happens, and this is true for so many of the images in the book. And then, of course, we had some that were scanned really well, and then we can, because throughout the book, we have some images that are just full spreads, and they just kind of act as breathers in between essays and entries. And so for those, of course, really well scanned images, we're able to print them really large. We can see all the details. And we also worked with Ado Smithhausen, who was amazing at color correcting some of the images. So to bring them closer to like a realistic color scheme, because with time, of course, like some of them were just like completely pink or brown. So yeah, my first impression was a bit of panic, but then of course we had eventually, like Sultan was saying, like a buildup of many options. And I think the fact that I joined the team relatively early on, maybe I gave the wrong impression in the beginning. Like I wasn't handed this giant archive instantly, but it was more like, oh, we found this new image of this building, and then we would think about replacing something we already did. And it was generally very enjoyable to be able to like really like mold something slowly and carefully. That's how it felt for me.
Farah, maybe this question is really adding to the horror. One person basically says, really love the selection of archival photographs. When is the next photo book coming out with the as yet unpublished photographs? So that's a question for you, Farah.
Totally. I mean, I'm up for working with the Sultan, Todd, and Reem literally any day, anytime. But this question would be more up to them.
Okay, perfect. Another thing that I wanted to also bring to the table as a discussion area for me, I remember when I looked at the book and grasped the content and tried to compare it to what I had as a perception on Sharjah and the narratives that I would assume to be correct or almost correct. And I think one of the things that I really looked into is how, especially with the architectural style that was followed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and 70s, I would say, was somehow different to what really emerged in the 80s with so-called influence of Islamic architecture. And for me, that was enlightening, to be honest, because for me, 60s to the 80s was the same architectural style, and I didn't really dive deep into how it really progressed or changed or evolved with time and the reasons behind it. So maybe a question to all again, how do you see the book really now with all the research somehow challenging some of the narratives and or perceptions on Sharjah in general that you see now very differently than you did before working on the book?
Can I start with answering this briefly? I think it's important to look at this book holistically. So I think rather than just look at the individual project, you can maybe when you pick up the book, you can just skim and look at other projects that were designed at the same time. Maybe you can read the bio of the architect when this architect had arrived in the UAE, then look at the timeline and see what happened in the previous 2 or 3 or 4 years that led to this design. So if you're really looking at for example, Islamic influence, what happened in the few years before that? If you're looking at a mega project, did that coincide with the discovery of oil in Sharjah? Mm. So all these things I think are tied, which is why we paid so much attention to the timeline, which is why we paid so much attention to biographies, which is why we paid so much attention to creating a context, such as the presence of Kuwait, the arrival, the discovery and the export of oil. All these items influenced even the architectural landscape in a city.
Todd, would you like to add to that? You're on mute, I think. Yeah,
Sorry about that. I think one thing that I would pick up, just to continue with what Sultan was saying about the timeline, we kept a timeline for us as an informal use to help us as we were going through, because we weren't composing a history from A to Z. We were just using what we could find and working, and as we did that, we tried to, no timeline is ever perfect or complete, but kind of keep one that the dates and the kind of numbers that meant something to us. And in the end, we published it in the book as part of the appendix. And I think we did that as a way of being quite transparent with how we were working. Again, no timeline is complete, and this one doesn't even attempt to be a complete one. Yet it was a way for us to begin to say, I think what you were doing as a reader, Shatha, is to give that experience to the reader, to begin to start to put together something that, I think we, in a large way, avoided a kind of giving a kind of clear overview of everything, only because it was we were looking at the city in such in a various number of ways, really, and I think we wanted to be careful that we didn't close those doors yet, especially because this book isn't I can't think of another book in English about Sharjah that has this kind of history in it. And that wasn't our role. I'm an architect. Reem is from an architectural background. Sultan is from a political science and an art background. And so we weren't quite prepared to write a heavy history, but we wanted to leave the parts. We wanted to make sure that the parts were open enough so that you could read that there is history inside of them.
Yeah, and I think that really leads to another question that we have from Yusuf. He says, there's some good stuff in this presentation. However, Sharjah offers much more in terms of architecture, building, old Sooud, dhows, Mina, port, etc. I did not see those. So what would be your response to that?
Maybe if I may start, maybe Reem and Todd would like to answer this as well. But we really weren't looking at logistics or at specific territories like the MENA. But we did try, Yusuf, and I think you're right. There were definitely elements we would have liked to have included. But as Todd said, we were definitely limited by archival images. We were limited with space constraints. This is a 400+ page book. So how much further can we go? I think this is an interesting and important introduction into a city of 1.7 million or so, the history of that city. But there's so much more to be said. But we did try to include images of the souk. We did try to include images of the airport. There's so much more to be done. And I think this is where you see the role now of the Sharjah National Archive in Sharjah. You see the role of the architectural triennial. You see the role of different parts of the city and the country as well, who can hopefully plug these gaps where we have fallen short.
Thank you, Sultan. Maybe one of the questions that I personally would like to have an answer to or have a discussion around, as you know, Sultan, Todd, Reem, and Farah, there are a lot of buildings specifically in Sharjah that are currently abandoned or are at the process of being demolished. And as you mentioned, Sultan, like Ammar al-Attar and others who are collecting so much archive around the buildings are doing a great job, in terms of partly preserving what could be preserved before a building is demolished. So how do you see the role of an individual person who really is concerned about the demolition and wants to add value and support? How do you see their role as an individual, I would say?
I can say something. I mean, not exactly the answer to your question, but something that I feel that is starting to become a prevailing knowledge happening, that modern architectural heritage does not necessarily have to be something that will preserve and not occupy. A building could be modern heritage and occupiable and accessible, with people still living in it. There is always this kind of misconception that whatever is a heritage site or a heritage building should be an artifact that no one can access, that should be just preserved, and you look as if it is a museum artifact or like an object, a collectible object. But there is a way to preserve and at the same time make these like project or building accessible.
True.
I think something that I would add too is I didn't approach this, and I'm speaking for myself, so each team member has his or her own opinion, but I didn't approach this project as a preservationist project. I don't necessarily take a stand one way or the other whether a building should come down or not. I think that discussion has changed dramatically in the last several years, when it's actually become an issue of needing to reuse resources. I mean, the demolition of buildings that are full of materials, especially concrete, is a real extreme waste of extracted resources from around the world, and that's really a compelling reason for me. I don't mean that buildings don't have cultural value and cultural meanings. I mean, we've seen wonderfully accessible examples of preservation here in Sharjah already, and those are ways to look forward. But in terms of, I think a book like this is also a way of, buildings also change. Do they need to look exactly how they did when they were designed? I think that kind of gets at what maybe Reem is saying, is if a building is lived in, it can also change as its uses might, for example. And I think that's something to recall, because I think, there are other ways that we can experience buildings if they do transform, or if they have, for one reason or another, need to be demolished, that they can be remembered in a certain way. Because if we don't remember them, then I think the history can easily get rewritten. And I think that's where things get unfortunate.
Would you like to add, Sultan? Okay, great. We have I guess we've already responded to another question where a lot of buildings, especially in Sharjah, I would say there are a few examples where they have been preserved and some that are in the line of to be demolished. Her question was basically, have most of all the older buildings in the city been restored and care of, or have they been demolished for new buildings? Is the old cherished? I would say I think we somehow answered that question. I would say another, maybe it may seem a fairly simple question, but I think it would really give insight into your own personal preferences and likings. I think for everyone, just to understand also further from each one of you, is there a specific aspect of history or building that you were most interested in writing and research? And if yes, why?
Reem, you want to start?
Bonnie can start.
Fine. Okay. Well, so the question is there a specific aspect in history? To be honest with you, Shatha, on my part, I was at one point in time scrambling just to get as much information as possible and then decide what I would be interested in. And the truth is that when I started, at least 2016, trying to interview, trying to meet people, some of these individuals became less and less accessible. I remember there was a case of an elderly Emirati gentleman who suffered a stroke within a few months after I first contacted him. And then I kept regretting that I wish I had asked him more questions. I wish I was better informed so my questions could be more in depth. And so all these issues really posed the challenge. For me, I was keen on finding more information about the role of Emirati architects, which you'd think there would be information about, but there was very little about. We had a number of Emirati architectural firms. We do highlight one of them in the book, but it wasn't enough. So this, as an Emirati, I wish there was more information. The role of women, which you said I tried to write about my mom. But again, it's kind of challenging to publish images of women in the 1970s and 80s. So that was one of the reasons in which I resorted to using my mom's archival history. Even showing other women with her, I had to opt not to use these photographs. And so for me, the Emirati angle was very interesting. And I could also tell you that there were images and there were aspects in which people shied away from being included. Some people would say, well, this was a very political part of the very political point in the history of the country. I remember a couple of times, Shatha, someone saying, oh, do you know this building was owned by an individual who was shunned or who had some kind of political mishap, and so they wouldn't want to be associated. In some cases, including an essay about an investigative magazine like Azman al-Arabiya was also a difficult decision. And how do we approach that? And I think Ali Al-Saba did a wonderful job about writing about this publication, because it was a moment in history in the late 70s and early 80s that we wanted to capture. So what we didn't include, I think, was many, many times more than what we did include in this book.
Thank you, Sultan. Reem, would you like to add?
I think I remember in the very beginning when I started working on this project, I was so fixated on this idea of including like the drawings of the buildings, like showing the buildings as objects in the book. And then eventually throughout, like maybe into the second year of research and finding more information and speaking to people and like conducting interviews, I started to become more interested in this idea of including the stories of the building rather than the building themselves. Like you cannot deassociate the building from the people or the city from the people. So it was really important to include both aspects and make the book less of an architectural book showing just architectural drawing that not everyone necessarily can read, but rather giving an account of how Sharjah, of what Sharjah looked like at that certain moment in time.
Thank you so much, Reem, and everyone. Another question that I have from Farah: is there anything in the socio-cultural features of Sharjah spaces that is unique, quite unique in comparison to other Emirates? Anyone would like to go on that question?
Todd, maybe since you studied the UAE and you looked at Dubai, maybe you can try to answer this.
Yeah, this is always a tricky question. I mean, I've looked at cities in the Gulf and also the UAE, and I find that once you try to start to make some generalization about cities, then you realize, oh no, they're so different. You have to give room for nuance. And then when you start to give nuance, you see, oh, but there's such a kind of general characteristic that we can find. And I find that really fascinating about cities of the Gulf, because there is this kind of tension between wanting to group them together, but also assertion of being very different. And I like that movement from one to the other. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I thought, after working so long on Dubai, moving onto Sharjah will be a fun diversion afterwards. And it really was the wrong way to go at it. I mean, you could kind of make a pre-oil history and a post-oil history, and it generally kind of works out the same, but it's actually, it reaches back. I mean, the competition between cities, between Sharjah and Dubai, between other Gulf cities for kind of global stature, for becoming a major trade hub, really, oftentimes you talk about the things that they overlap in doing, or making, redundant uses, or developing redundant kinds of infrastructure, but they're also, looking for ways to diversify not just their own economies, but diversify from the rest, let's say, of the UAE economy. So I didn't give anything specific, but only the way that I guess I've had to approach that kind of question.
If I may, Shada, if I'm also may try to answer this, I think just building on Reem's point and also Todd's point, that cities are products of the individuals who live there. So who are the individuals who moved to Sharjah in the 50s and 60s? Because they brought with them their ideas. They were the entrepreneurs. They were the pioneers. They were the teachers, the nurses, the doctors, the engineers, the architects. They're the ones who shaped the city. In addition to the local citizens, in addition to I'm 43 years old and I still don't know how to refer to somebody from Sharjah. The Sharjahs who I think occupy the space. And so if you think about the Sharjah's historical context, the presence of certain individuals impacted the architecture and the urban space that you see around. But Sharjah also has its own dynamic force. You have an educated population that went and started a women's association, that went on to design a building, to host this association. So you need to look at that local historical context in order for you to understand what differentiates slightly Sharjah from Ajman, from Dubai, from Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait and elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Sultan. Looking at other questions that I have, maybe another question I think is very important also, that you have a lot of researchers, urban planners, designers, architects who want to really contribute to the content of the book and the research. So how do you see this as a future step, Sultan, Todd, Reem, and Farah? How do you see contributing to this research in the future?
Todd, do you want to answer? I feel like I spoke too much.
I could give a, it's I also see there's a question from Bhumika that's a bit similar to what you just said. So I'm reading that one as well. about self-awareness and being researchers and editors, and that you're creating narratives. And I appreciate hearing that comes through, whether in the book or in this this talk. But yeah, I mean, I think when, there's this frustration that there aren't a lot of established published sources to work with, that you realize that you are kind of crafting something that is not existing. And so, if there is already a mega narrative that you either want to support or fight back against, then that's actually a little bit easier. Then you know your stance. But when, I'm not suggesting that there isn't a narrative, a shared, let's say, a larger narrative shared by a community about Sharjah. But nevertheless, there was this feeling that, we were, through architecture, describing a city's urban development from, let's say, the 50s onward. And so, yeah, we were making statements that hadn't really been stated about the city yet. But also, and when you say, oh, but future people can take the story onward or contest it even, but that's also kind of dropping the ball in a way, by saying you don't have to do it, but let the other ones do it. So there's a little bit of a give and take there in terms of taking responsibility, but also allowing the book to be written in a way that the door is still open for more people to come in.
Yeah, I have a very similar question. Again, people who are willing to volunteer, help in any which way. And I think this goes for me and everyone else who really were intrigued with the content of the book and really would like to, support, whether it's spreading awareness of the book. I would basically maybe say to everyone, please purchase the book at Art Jamil. You have them. I have written that down here. You would have few copies at the Sharjah Book Fair and the Gulf Photo Plus. I think these are the main places where you can actually purchase this book, because I think it really is a step. For me, it was really a stepping stone to look really deep into family archives, I would say, and it's something that I've always promised myself that I would do sometime in my lifetime, but I eventually always postponed it. So I think it's something that really is a question of how we can really support collectively and work towards building that narrative together, I would say. I think these are almost the questions that, okay, I have a question that just came in right now with Salim Sooud, so I'm going to read it out entirely because it's a long one. What role has discourse of urban cultural geography of the West played in building this book and understanding Sharjah, if it did? Were there certain moments or cultural thoughts that helped discrete and interpret the archive and the building of the city, or was it solely built on just the context of Sharjah? I find it hard not directly thinking of Western academia when I think of reading cities, simply because of studying in the West.
If I may try to answer this, thank you, Salim Sooud, for the question. Certainly, I mean, we definitely had to use resources from the West. There was a lot of cultural, a lot of the archives were based there. A lot of the theory is based on Western theory, but a lot of times this was proven untrue. A lot of times these archives were useless to us, but we did have to explore them. So we did have to approach these archives, but it doesn't mean that we were always successful in finding issues there. I think, to be honest with you, some of the richest archives, some of the richest sources we found about a city in the East was in the East. So we went to Amman, and we went to Bombay, and we went to Karachi, and we went to Beirut, and we went to Cairo, and we went to Istanbul. And that is where we found the history of Sharjah city. And I think that reflects Sharjah's position. It doesn't mean that London and Minnesota were not useful. They were useful. But I think you need to expand your understanding of, the resources and your understanding of what researching a city in the East would mean. Unfortunately, and I think I want to link this to the question earlier, Shatha, in which somebody asked, what can we do as lay persons? What we can do, and again, I'm not somebody who studied architecture or urbanism, but what we can do is start with our own homes, our own family archives, our own grandparents or parents' archives, or going to friends. What we can do now is try and preserve through photography. What we can do is either write or discuss or talk or even attend events like this and share them with individuals and build the culture of hope, the culture of trying to appreciate the environment in which we live. So I hope that answers your question, Salim. I know that you are very active in doing this, so I salute you.
Thank you so much, Sultan. I think we are almost close to our wrap up. Maybe just a final comment or note from each one of you would be great for all of our audiences and any aspirations or hopes after the publication that we just talked about.
I'll go first, just because I'd like to comment as well on this question, maybe from another angle than what Sultan took it on, this question about the West and in the context of Sharjah. And, one thing that especially in my interest is the role of the architect. And the architect is often seen as this foreign expertise that arrives and brings with him or her ideas of somewhere else. And I think oftentimes that's seen as someone coming from the West. And what I really loved about this project was we started to see that it's not such a complicated, it's not such an easy distinction to be made between the West and somewhere else. Obviously we have architects, coming from all these cities that Sultan has just mentioned. I won't go through them again, but many of them were, for example, educated in France or educated in the US or educated in another Arab country or somewhere else, even in Eastern Europe. And I think that, suddenly even the exchanges, the kind of let's say the purity of a nationality isn't so easy to identify. And I think that's also one of the beautiful things about this project, that if you actually spend time looking at who is building or who are the people that we were able to document, that even their lives aren't easy to peg down as where are they from.
Thank you so much, Todd, for that last remark. Anyone else? Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Sultan, Todd, Reem, Farah, for the amazing work that you guys did on the book. I think there isn't, at least I would say, anyone from Sharjah, there isn't anyone who would really not thank you on this this book. It really adds to Sharjah, the UAE, and the globe in terms of where we are, who we are, and I think it's a privilege, of course, to moderate this session. I would, of course, like to also thank the organizers, NYU Abu Dhabi, for hosting us for this incredible 1.5 hour. And again, thank you all for all the efforts and for attending and accepting the invitation to this panel discussion. Thank you so much.